welcome. So, thought I'd do a video on Emmanuel Todd and his family systems theory. Um, this has been a little bit more popularized recently because Todd has written some recent books about contemporary sort of geopolitical situations. Mainly, he's kind of emerged as a critic or an observer of the kind of Anglo-American decline of the sort of position of the Anglo-American um, kind of post-war order, and then how it's kind of declining and it's going into sort of conflicts with other parts of the world. And um, and he's written recent books about this issue, more contemporary stuff. But he has in the past, in his book that we're going to look at here, or at least the introduction of, he has done like kind of anthropological, like really kind of empirical, kind of anthropological research on family systems. Now, what do we mean by family systems? It's really things to do with authority and equality. Really, these are the kind of the two big kind of coordinates we need to look at here. Um, how families systems from around the world deal with things like inheritances and deal with things like sharing living space, like stuff that's kind of seen as almost banal or sort of routine or boring or something. It really is like at the heart of, at least this is his kind of argument here, this is at the heart of our ideological contentions. And he views modern ideologies like things like liberalism, social democracy, fascism, communism, all these things as sort of manifestations of these older anthropological um, family systems. Um, so you've probably seen, a lot of people have seen this stuff to some extent online. I think there's a few kind of relatively famous YouTube channels that have made videos about it, but I kind of found these videos were all kind of skipping over the the details that are kind of crucial. And I thought I would just I download the book. I downloaded the book. You can't. I couldn't buy it on Amazon. I don't know why. Like there was nothing available, so I don't know. Maybe it's because it's, I don't know, it hasn't been supplied or whatever. But you can get PDFs online, and I got a PDF. And I'm reading the book, so I've read the introduction, and I want to just like make a kind of basic outline video, and then maybe in the future go into more detail about different specific areas in the book. But we'll do like a very kind of general overview today. I should also point out that I'm going to concentrate on European family systems. Todd does talk about like outside of Europe. He talks about other countries and parts of Asia and Africa and so on. But I'm just going to concentrate on Europe in this introductory video because I kind of think that European modern history, it really needs explaining, and it hasn't really been explained very well. And this really does actually help. So, just as we get going in this little talk, he took these ideas originally from this dude called Pierre Frederick Laplay. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. And Laplay was a sociologist, as you can see, economist, and he was around in the kind of early to mid, I suppose early, his whole life was kind of early to late 19th century, kind of aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars he was probably growing up in. And he, as far as I know, he was he was Catholic, and he was a bit kind of reactionary. He didn't like the way that things were going, and he came up with this kind of family system idea, which Todd basically based his studies from. Although Todd has updated and sort of adapted it slightly. We're going to be looking at Todd's version of this, but it's sort of based roughly on older anthropological research done on family systems. This guy apparently kind of traveled around Europe, and he kind of took a very hands-on empirical approach, and he looked at the way different family systems were functioning. And this is all based, by the way, on research that is sort of like, I think it's kind of like 18th century stuff. Like it's 18th century, it's pre-revolutionary France. It's 18th century, it's kind of early modern era, 18th century um, research on these family systems. It's not as old as I thought it was. Like when I first heard this theory, I was thinking that this must go back to like the 15th century or something. But no, this is actually like it's kind of 18th, maybe 17th to a certain extent. So it's kind of early modern era, which this research is coming from, which is important maybe because it's like not crazy old, but it's pre-modern too. I mean, if you look at the American and French Revolution as kind of, or the Industrial Revolution is kind of like the markers of modernity. It is coming from pre-modern data. So this guy anyway was the kind of starter of this family systems theorizing, and then Todd adapted and borrowed it to make it his own. Okay, so here are the main European family systems, and this is European. So there's other ones outside of Europe, but these are the European ones. So we got main ones. We got absolute nuclear, and I'm going to explain these in more detail, at least enough detail to give you a bit more context soon. But you got absolute nuclear, which basically is, and there's a map I'm going to show you in a minute. But absolute nuclear family system is kind of the Anglosphere, basically the south of England, and the Netherlands, and I think parts of Denmark too. Then you got the STEM family, which is also called the authoritarian family. Todd changed this from authoritarian to STEM. I don't know why, but this is basically the Germanic world, Scandinavia, and the Celtic world too. So Ireland, Scotland. Wales is more complicated, but it's Ireland, Scotland, and also south of France. There's a map we'll look at, so we'll get into more detail on this in a minute. Egalitarian nuclear family is, it's a few places. It's North Italy and North France and some other parts of the world. It's kind of Mediterranean-y. It's parts of Spain as well. There's a kind of Mediterranean flavor to this egalitarian nuclear family. The most important one is probably North France, because that's where the most kind of most important kind of political historical stuff has happened in the modern world. And then lastly, you got the community family, which is basically Russia and parts of basically like parts of Eastern Europe and Russia, basically. There's a rough map that he's made in the book, which is kind of giving you coordinates. Liberty, inequality, authority, and equality. And this is a sort of map you can sort of get a rough gauge of how each of these categories responds to, let's say, the tension between liberty and authority, the tension between inequality and equality. So, like, in order to think this way, you have to throw out what you think about this universalistic, simple kind of idea of like progressive and conservative, like authority and liberty. This very simplistic, easy to understand sort of kind of, line you can draw from one to the other, in which everyone is gradually just moving towards something which is more progressive. This is something which is sort of abstracted from, according to Todd, and I would totally agree with this. According to Todd, is abstracted from anthropological reality, and it's just like this sort of universalistic abstraction, which is really a manifestation of the Anglosphere, actually, and to some extent maybe the egalitarian nuclear family as well, a little bit. There's an and this is the problem. So Laplay, the French guy previously, this is basically the problem he had. It was like after the French Revolution, history and the world was being described in this very simplistic way of like progressive or conservative. That was the only way to look at the world, and he wanted to kind of complicate it and kind of ground things in an anthropological more concrete anthropological reality, and say that things are influenced by that. In a more sort of, I suppose you could call it even like a more multipolar way. It's not like there's not like kind of this unipolar world where one progressive society is sort of drawing everyone closer and closer to it. The sort of end of history idea. There's something more like a kind of multipolarity of different anthropological, concrete sort of. Now, what you can ask the philosophical question, like, what are these? Are these like are these substantial things? Are they just ingrained in genetics? Are they ingrained in um, are they ingrained in like what like is like there's something metaphysical about them? Is like is it just based in custom? Is it how malleable is it? Can it just be changed? So on, so on, so on. These questions, kind of philosophical questions, kind of ontological questions about like, well, what is this system? Like, what's the sort of substance of this system? That's that should be asked. Like he hasn't provided an answer for that yet. So I don't think he will. I think he just he sort of just he doesn't go that philosophically deep. He's just going to probably take them as like as sort of kind of realities that are sort of anthropological givens or something. Where did they come from? Why are they there? Why are they different? That's a good question. But anyway, that's maybe for a different video. Let's assume that they're there and that they have some sort of reality to them. These are the kind of coordinates which you can go by. But first, let's just look at the map. Before we look at the ideological distinctions or characteristical distinctions, let's just look at the map. Because again, I've seen this map falsely made by people on YouTube and online. This is the map from his book. This is the map he has in the original copy of the book. I feel like people these days just don't fucking read the original source material or something. Anyway, so as you see, you got so absolute nuclear family. This is England, Holland, and Denmark. Okay, and parts of the very northwest of France. Although it's really weird because like suddenly you can just have like a pocket of the authoritarian or the STEM family. You can have a pocket of STEM family here. But anyway, like roughly speaking, it's all very kind of there's always pockets of something weird here and there. But roughly speaking, you got the absolute nuclear family being Holland, England, and Denmark. Then you got the egalitarian nuclear family. That's France, North Italy, parts of southern Italy, Spain, at least not North Spain, Poland, weirdly enough. I was surprised about that. Greece, it's kind of Mediterranean-ish, you could say. Then you got the authoritarian family or the STEM family. These two words are kind of used interchangeably in the book. I don't know why, but anyway. And you basically got let's go back up to the top. You got Celtic, basically Celtic countries, Ireland, Scotland. You don't have Wales for some reason. I feel like Wales should be complicated there. Maybe anyway. You got Scandinavia. You got basically all the Germanic speaking parts of the world, and then including Belgium. Essentially you got and also Czechoslovakia, which is now Czech Republic, obviously, but and you got Norway and Sweden. Yeah, there you go. So basically, kind of like Central Europe, Germany, Celtic nations, and Scandinavian, right? And then you got this is basically the Russian one, exogamous. I'm so bad at pronouncing these words. Exogamous community family. This word exogamous basically means that you don't breed inside, you breed outside. This is a breeding marriage, a marital sociological term. So just forget about that right now. So you got all these places. You got basically all of Russia. You got Finland as well. Big shout out to any Finnish mutuals I have. You big communists. Because this is the community family. This is where communism comes from. And then you got Hungary, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, blah 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 blah. North Italy too, actually, and also like a weird pocket in the middle of France there. So basically, like the very 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 vulgar and rough thing you could do here, which is kind of what Todd's done. I'm not saying it's vulgar in a stupid way. It's just like, just to introduce the idea, is you can basically say, okay, look at this community family, communism. Look at this authoritarian family, fascism. Um, Ireland and Scotland are more complicated here, and so are Scandinavia. But there is some, but there is roughly speaking, it does explain this part of the world, and then at least in the 20th century, and then egalitarian nuclear family. You have like a kind of like a liberalism or republicanism and liberalism, but it's sort of like different in different ways, which we'll have to explain. Um, it's different to the other one, which is absolute family. And it's basically fucking liberalism. This is just like capitalist liberalism, um, individualism, basically in a nutshell. This one's won. This, like, if you look at the 20th century, this one basically won. Mainly because if the map was bigger and we got on a boat and went blah, 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 you got America, and America is like, well, actually, you'd probably have to complicate America a lot here too, because there's probably like lots of different influences mixed in there. But more or less, the leaders of America, like the sort of elites, the people who run America, are this one. They're absolute nuclear family. They're the liberal capitalist sort of nation. So this one won the big race, and it's and the problem that Todd has, many other people have, is that we sort of live in the world of this one, of the absolute nuclear family. We like live in this world, but we think of it as universal, and we think it, and we now think of politics purely in this frame. And I like, just to give you a quick example of why this is an interesting theory to me. When you hear people from the Anglosphere talk about left and right, they automatically assume that the right is like pro-capitalist and like the left is like anti-capitalist, where there's loads of complications with that very simplistic idea. If you throw in all of these complications of all these different systems and you think of the way they think, it is much more complicated than that. But we're sort of stuck in this kind of post-historical, like kind of neoliberal sort of stagnation, I would almost say. And a part of that stagnation is that we assume the absolute nuclear family to be a kind of universal. So I do want to go into at least briefly a sort of more like concrete, descriptive exercise of describing the distinctions, I can't speak anymore, of these systems. But before that, I want to do one more thing, which is basically something Todd points out in the... What I like about this is he does use some empirical data, and I'm not really like an empirical data guy. I'm like a real sort of speculative, philosophical kind of person. So I'm sort of developing an appetite a little bit here for some of this empirical stuff. And so for example, well, Todd points out in the introduction that the failure of political science is basically like sort of not looking at this kind of underlying anthropological structure and taking it seriously. And for example, if you look at very like materialistic explanations of modern society, and if you look at very sort of like simplistically linear explanations of modern society, you start to see some contradictions. And here's one he just briefly points out in the introduction. He gives you a map here of like the population of the working class employed in industry in 1970. This is really, really, really empirical. Like the percentage of the active population employed in industry in 1972, percentage of the communist votes in the late 60s. The exact dates are given in. Okay. So this is like how much votes did communist parties receive in these countries, and how much of the population is employed as like a proletariat, basically, as like a working class people in industries. If you take a very simplistic Marxian view, you would say, well, okay, the more like when you have an urbanized proletariat, you have an inevitable inclination towards communism. This is a very sort of simplistic, materially deterministic, linear view. But if you look at a map like this, you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Like, look at it. Look at the UK. The UK had at the time a very like nearly half the population is like what you would consider like a kind of urbanized proletariat. Um, and look how many votes the Communist Party's got, 0.2%. Belgium, 44, only 3.3%. So higher, right? And that actually fits the model because if Belgium is a, anyway, I'll explain this later. Italy, 26%, and it's I mean it's similar to the UK, but it's like a shocking difference. Um, Austria, is that Austria? Austria, 40%, but yeah, five. So it's yeah, bigger, much bigger than the UK, bigger than Belgium, but it's still nothing compared to Italy. Australia, that's like, okay. So basically, like Anglosphere, tiny, tiny. Even though they got like large populations, you know. France, oh, what's this? What's going on here? 20. What's like, you know what I mean? Like that's just like, I mean, so you see the patterns that he was noticing. Like Italy, these are the egalitarian nuclear family. In France, egalitarian nuclear family. You got big. Finland, it was in the community family one, and you got like a much smaller working class. You know what I mean? And then so basically, how do you explain these anomalies? Like, why are the like why is the Anglosphere so small votes for communist parties, even though in this case and in this case you got really high working class population? Well, Todd would say it's because of the anthropological reality underlying the family system, and that's why you have this contradiction. Whereas when you get the authoritarian family system or STEM family system, you have higher votes, but it's not that much. And then when you have the egalitarian nuclear family, it's like huge. So this is basically the kind of thing that Todd looks at and goes, well, this we need to take this seriously. What's going on here? Okay, so I'm going to read from the introduction, and we're going to get deeper explanations for all these different systems. Okay, so 1 second. If I can zoom this up. Type 4. This is the community family. Authoritarian and egalitarian produces the densest family forms. All the sons have an equal right to their father's succession. So this is when I was talking earlier how things like succession, inheritance, relationship to authority, relationship to fraternity, brotherhood, sharing, or unequal or equal, blah, blah, blah. This is what he's talking about. These are the distinctions in the family systems, which we in our big universalized liberal sort of individualistic world completely take for granted. But these are the things that we used to be very, very sort of more characteristically, let's say, obvious. Anyway, so type 4, authoritarian and egalitarian, produces the densest family forms. All the sons have equal right to their father's succession, but all of them continue as married adults to live with the elder generation, producing an undivided family community, which Laplace calls patriarchal. Each brother brings his wife and children into this group, and all of them remain under the authority of the father, a proper patriarch. So in this situation, basically, you have a father figure who is the real kind of head of the house, and as all the sons are kind of equal to him. You know what I mean? His sons are all equal. You know, it's not like the eldest gets everything. It's this kind of equal, brotherly affection. But the father is like really, really strong. On the death of the head of so when he dies, the father, each of the brothers may, if he so wishes, claim his share of the succession and found his own household, which as it grows will in turn make him a patriarch. This model combines vertical characteristics, a close father-son relationship, with horizontal ones, strong ties between brothers. So it's a kind of combination of the authority, and that makes sense again if you look like Stalinism. It's kind of what's kind of going on there. It's like you have this sort of, you know, there's always been this explanation, this sort of question of like, well, why are these countries that are really inegalitarian in certain ways? Why are these countries like in Asia or in Russia that are sort of okay with big strong leaders, communists? Like that in our liberal universalized mind, that doesn't make any sense. But actually, it does make sense if you look at the anthropological kind of reality to how these family systems were functioning at the time. Okay, so type 3. So this is the STEM family, or the authoritarian family, the one I was saying earlier, which is the Germanic, Central Europe, Celtic, and Scandinavian. Okay. Um, Type 3, authoritarian and inegalitarian, maintains a close vertical association between the father and the one son. So it's this one particular son. And it would normally be the eldest, I assume. Um, Maybe not always, but I presume they put a custom in there, because otherwise it's like, well, who's it going to be? There's kind of a lot of kind of, you know, ambiguity. They don't want the ambiguity; it can lead to conflict. So this is why normally it's kind of, when we watch old films about, like, the aristocrats or something, they always say the oldest son is anyway. That's where that comes from. A close vertical association between the father and the son, and the one son who will succeed him as head of the family. The other brothers must leave what LaPlay calls the STEM family, or if they stay, they must remain unmarried. So there's a bit of an inceldom thing going on there, isn't there? Uh, Anyway, I'll try to refrain from making comments about our contemporary time when I read this stuff, because I want to do that in later videos. In this system, the heir may be the eldest son, primogenitor, blah, 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 this is these words, or the youngest. It could be the oldest or the youngest. Okay, which is weird. Like, maybe that's why we have jokes about the middle child being, like, irrelevant or something. I wonder why it's the oldest or the youngest. It's interesting. But it could be the oldest or the youngest, right? Or even one of the other ones chosen by the father, but normally the eldest or the youngest. Okay. Type 2, liberal and egalitarian, is the exact opposite of type 3. It requires rapid separation of the father and sons, and equal division of the succession between the children. The play calls this type the unstable family. The principles of liberty and equality, or their opposites, are quite compatible with type 2, 3, and 4. The components, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Type 1, liberal and inegalitarian, which LaPlay rejects as a practical possibility, combines apparently contradictory concepts. If none of the adult children is required to live with the father, what purpose is served by the inegalitarian principle of indivisible succession? The liberal family has no interest in household continuity, in the permanence of the liberal group over time. Of the permanence of the family group over time. If the original household is going to disappear anyway, why not practice a simple division of spoils? Such reasoning refuses to see the ideas of liberty and equality as first principles, part of the way of thinking, which are not necessarily tied to a particular social or economic environment. Okay, so I feel like, as I read this, and as if you're listening to this, you're probably confused as to the difference between 1 and 2. Like, I feel like generally 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 are clearly different to each other. It's basically, you got kind of like liberalism, you got sort of like more kind of authoritarian traditionalism or something like that, and then you've got like kind of a communism, basically, and that makes sense. But like, what is going on with 1 and 2? How is the Anglosphere different to, let's say, North France or North Italy? What is the distinction there? I think that part is confusing, and I'm going to try to explain that now. So if you're still with me on this, I've decided that before I'm going to explain the difference between 1 and 2, basically the difference between the absolute nuclear family and the egalitarian nuclear family, I want to first explain the difference between the nuclear family and the authoritarian family. That was okay, 1 and 3. So the absolute nuclear family and the authoritarian or STEM family. That may seem obvious. Like, well, one's liberal and one's authoritarian. Blah 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 blah. One's no. Okay, you guys. This is where you got to complicate it. They both express different forms of inequality. Okay. But they're very different forms of inequality. Okay, and I thought the best way to explain this would basically be to say the inequality of the warrior versus, and I'm kind of making this into kind of archetypal stuff here, right? Which is kind of suitable because we're talking about Europe, and Europe's triad is suitable to bring up here. The Indo-European triadic structure. The warrior and the merchant Now, the warrior is obviously three. It's the Germanic, Celtic, Scandinavian um, archetype. And then you got the merchant, which is more the Anglo archetype, more mercantile, more focused on economy and money and stuff, which exactly just explains history as well, right? Um, roughly speaking, you got two different forms of inequality here. Neither of these dudes are particularly egalitarian, but they're egalitarian for very different reasons and in very different ways, with a very different set of values behind that. So if you think about what Todd said earlier, it's like this guy, the warrior, his inheritance is, let's say he's the oldest son, right, or the youngest son, or whatever is the son who's going to inherit. He his inheritance is indivisible. That basically means what he gets, he does not sell it. Like this is passed down from generations and generations and generations, and he keeps it in his family, and he becomes a sort of, you could even say, like a representative of that kind of historical legacy or something like this, right? Um, it's kind of more rooted in history. It's kind of more rooted in tradition. It's more based on a sense of kind of the responsibility of the leader, kind of who's representing something older and bigger than themselves. And then you got the inequality of the merchant. So the inequality of the merchant obviously is unequal, but it's not really so concerned with like kind of tradition and honor and legacy. It's okay with just like getting rid of the inheritance and selling it, but it won't necessarily commit to distributing that inheritance based on egalitarian principles, right? That's the difference. It like imagine this guy gets everything, but he just fucking sells it, and he goes around like buying fancy shit and being a big decadent merchant. Like that's unequal, but it's very different to this guy's inequality. It's a very different expression of inequality, and this is kind of where the kind of nuance comes in, where people overlook it these days. They kind of say, well, these people represent something unequal, so they're both like right wing or something like this, or they're both traditional or something like. And then this doesn't make any sense. If you think about it for 10 seconds, it doesn't make any sense. And this is the complications that we need to introduce. So let's go back to the actual text. I'm going to read a little bit of what is kind of said in more detail about the about system 3 and system 1. I want to make sure I get the right parts here. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, one second. So this is Todd basically kind of saying we need to take the absolute nuclear family as a kind of thing in and of itself. Like how can you say it's liberal and egalitarian? This is kind of the same problem we have today, where we automatically think a country that's sort of like pro-capitalistic is like automatically like right wing or something. Now, like right wing with all the baggage attached, like traditional or like something like this, right? Like these really simplistic ways of thinking. This is what we need to sort of like dissolve and sort of be more sophisticated about. All right, so type 1, liberal and inegalitarian, which LePlay calls a practical, which LePlay, the older sociologist, rejects as a practical possibility, combines apparently contradictory concepts. If none of the adult children is required to live with the father, what purpose is served by the inegalitarian principle of the indivisible succession? So remember, in the kind of authoritarian model, you have a indivisible succession. Someone becomes a kind of representative. The inheritance is seen almost like as a kind of sacred object that someone has to, like one person has to kind of take responsibility for and be a representative and a kind of carer for, or a kind of steward of, or something like this, right? But what purpose? The liberal family has no interest in household continuity. All right, so the authoritarian system, they have a lot of interest in household continuity. The liberal family does not. The type 1 family does not. The liberal family has no interest in household continuity, in the permanence of the family group over time. If the original household is going to disappear anyway, why not practice a simple division of spoils? Just sell it, get what you want out of it. Who cares? You know, kind of sounds like the kind of sounds like all the things we complain about with boomers, doesn't it? Okay, I said I wasn't going to comment on things right now, but it does. It kind of sounds like this is the way boomers think of the world, isn't it? You know. Anyway, in practice, a liberal family system excluding cohabitation between parents and adult children, which is indifferent to the concept of equality, can be observed and plays own work. In England, Holland, and according to recent work in historical anthropology in Denmark, the father expects his children to found their own households, but sets about dividing his property in his will without being bound by precise conventions of inheritance. So it's without being bound as precise conventions of inheritance. Now, I will note that in France they have way stricter laws about inheritance. Like your inheritance is done very equally among all the siblings. I have a friend who's French, and he's all angry because actually I shouldn't say this because I'm kind of giving away his personal family, but he's angry because he has a sibling that isn't really a sibling, if you get what I mean, and it's sort of just like a given that person's getting their share. You know, it's very strict. It's like the sort of rules are like, you know, your children will equally inherit, and you don't fuck around with it. Like, you don't go, well, maybe I'll give it to one kid, maybe I won't give it to the other kid, maybe I'll give it to this kid. You know, you don't kind of play games. It's that, you know, they're not that interested in like family continuity and kind of the kind of, you know, this kind of traditional way that the authoritarian family is concerned with, but they're also quite egalitarian about the way in which the spoils are given, if that makes sense. The father expects his children to found their own households, but sets about dividing his property in his will without being bound by precise conventions of inheritance. While not systemically inegalitarian like the STEM family, this type is not egalitarian. Not knowing what to make of his family model, which he observed in England, Laplace concluded that it was a degenerate form of the STEM family, authoritarian and egalitarian. That's the STEM family. So Laplace thought it was confused by the English model. He kind of thought it was like a degenerate form of basically the Germanic or the Celtic model. He thought it was a strange degenerate form of that. He couldn't make sense of it. Thus introducing into his model an evolutionary tendency very much in line with the ideas of his time, but which dismisses the force and originality of an approach which would later be called structuralist. Okay, that part is a bit not important. But both deduction and observation reveal that the existence of two liberal models. So this is okay. So now we can go into the difference between the two liberal models, the one and the two. The kind of, let's say, the French liberal model and like the English liberal model. But both deduction and observation reveal the existence of two liberal models, two forms of what Laplace called unstable family, the nuclear family in the language of modern sociology. It is in fact found in its purest form when the egalitarian ideal is rejected and the father is free to disinherit some of the children. So this is the kind of the more Anglo model. The resulting uncertainty about succession is at first sight a formidable weapon in the service of parental authority, but looked at from a point of view of the values which underlie an anthropological system, its significance is quite different. Disinheriting a child means accepting an absolute break between the generations and allows that there may be no tie between father and son. It amounts to denying the strength of the biological relationship. So, let's say French model, egalitarian nuclear family model. Yeah, like, look, no one's going to get really romantic about, you know, this is the home and you have to hold on to this home for generations and generations and be representative of it. No one's going to get really, like, sentimental about that. Everyone will go, okay, let's just sell it and go their own ways. But they're going to do that. They're going to strongly commit to an egalitarian way of doing that, so all the sons know that their dad's not going to fucking stab them in the back, basically. And he's going to be, like, giving them all their equal share. And they kind of live in a sense of at least a kind of a psychological security that they know that, like, that their father is committed to them. Although in an egalitarian way, he's still committed to them. And there's a sort of strong relationship then which retains between the father and the son, even if he's egalitarian. But in the absolute nuclear family model, it's kind of this one found in England and in the Netherlands, there isn't that commitment. You can just do it. You can just be like, oh, I don't like this one. I'm just gonna, give everything to the other one. Do you know what I mean? Or like for whatever reason, like who knows why? There's like 100 different reasons why. Um, so it's like non-committal. It's very much a non, and that's very important for orientating the relationship of the young to the old, and orientating how we see authority. And I think that again makes sense if you look at neoliberalism, which sprung up out of the Anglo-American world. You see like why should we sort of commit to younger generations having jobs, or why should we commit to younger generations being able to own property, or why should we commit to anything about them? If they don't work hard enough, screw them. This boomer, we have these kind of memes about boomers, and they're like, they had it easy. We, the younger generations, have it hard, and they kind of refuse to relate to that, to the different conditions that different generations are growing up in. They're very non-committal about a lot of this stuff, and that's because the Anglosphere won the civilizational war at the end of the 20th century, and especially with neoliberalism, and we sort of live in that moral matrix now. And now people are like looking at like the relationship they have to their boomer parents, and maybe this is the same thing in lots of countries, not just in the Anglosphere. Nowadays, it's probably many parts of the world, and they're going, "What the fuck is this? What the fuck is this?" So anyway, uh, so there's a kind of break in the generations. There's a sort of non-committal break in the generations, which obviously has lots of different consequences, not just in terms of like money, but just in terms of like morality, history, identity, all this stuff is called into question here. Okay, so he says, I'll continue reading. In the egalitarian model, however, the father and son are bound together legally, unable to escape an apparently natural determinism. An egalitarian inheritance system undermines the basic principle of the nuclear family, the separation of the father and the son. So this sort of egalitarian nuclear family is in some weird sense more traditional than the inegalitarian nuclear family, because the inegalitarian nuclear family will cut ties with generations willy-nilly, but the egalitarian nuclear family, you get in the kind of French or like North Italian model, is kind of committed to a kind of social contract, we could say, between the generations. It's sort of committed to familial, more committed, not as committed as Type 3, not as committed as the kind of Germanic and Celtic older world, but it's committed nonetheless more so to some sort of familial cohesion, or kind of generational solidarity or something like that. Okay, so the last part of the book, sorry, this is just the introduction, that I want to explore a little bit, is just this idea of psychopolitics, because Todd points to basically this, which is a new way of thinking about the political, which is you might call it psychopolitics. And it's kind of something that's become more and more popular in recent times. It's kind of taking certain psychic forces and psychic tendencies to be more present and more seriously like accountable within kind of how we politically orientate ourselves and our systems we create and all this stuff. This goes back really to Plato originally. You could say Plato was really the first psychopolitician or psychopolitical theorist. His whole notion of a republic, his whole notion of politics was like bound to the structure of the soul, and the classes and different structure of the society, social structure of the society, was a reflection of the structure of the soul. So it was really, it's really something that I always like to remind people of, that this is like not new. This goes back. This is a different way of thinking about politics. What's interesting is that you do have, I think, somewhat also with Freud, but in the modern world, a kind of reintroduction of something you could call psychopolitics, or something resembling psychopolitics, which is to say, not everything's determined by like purely determined by material conditions, and purely determined by technology are purely determined by like like scientific progress or something like this. These are two simplistic ways of thinking of the world. We do have these strange sort of like underlying, rather unconscious a lot of the time, psychopolitical structures. A lot of people don't like to think in this way. They don't like to think about the unconscious within politics. They like to think politics is just like a bunch of rational people all doing what's good for them or something like this. Um, but there just is. I just think this is just nonsense, and there clearly is within our political structures a kind of psychology, a psychological force, which is grounded in something older that we don't always understand. And Todd just briefly points out that with Freud, you have a kind of reintroduction of this. That Freud sort of returned us, or at least opened up the potential to return us to thinking about the political, somewhat more similar to how Plato and Aristotle thought of it, which was in terms of a kind of psychopolitics, the kind of structure of the mind, structure of the soul, has a kind of input on, has a kind of reflective, observational legitimacy we can kind of wield in order to think about politics and political systems. But the criticism he has of Freud, though, was that Freud basically, as you can see here, I call this part Freud, Brotherhood, and Blind Spots, is that Freud didn't speak about brotherhood. So Freud was like very, very interested in this sort of relationship of authority. The father and the son, or the children and the father, basically the father and the son, and the Oedipal complex, and all this kind of relationship between authority and the kind of super egoic nature maybe to the parents, and the child having to sort of like adapt to that and then sort of rebel against that, and this sort of relationship of authority of one generation to another, but which is good, but he didn't talk about the other thing, which is the equality inequality thing, which is the brotherhood structure. So something that Todd mentions here is basically that if you take system 1, the absolute nuclear family, and also if you take system 3, the STEM family, they both have a little bit of a problem with brotherhood. Like they don't really deal with brotherhood, or fraternity. I mean, this is like the French again. Like the French have a strong notion of this. Égalité, liberté, fraternité. It's in their kind of founding national slogan. This idea of fraternity. This is kind of the byproduct also of these family systems where the sons are not treated equally. So when the sons are treated equally, which is like the communist model, the community family, and also the egalitarian nuclear family, the kind of French and Italian model, the kind of stronger notion of brotherhood evolves, and that makes them more inclined also to like communism, for example, because communism really comrade, there's a strong sense of kind of fraternity within communism. It's actually the thing I liked about communism when I was younger. I was kind of attracted to it, and I never knew why really, and I think this is probably for this reason, that it gives off a strong sense of fraternal solidarity. The 3 and 1, as different as they are when it comes to generational commitments, because 3 is quite good on generational commitments. 3 is quite is much more concerned with generational commitments than 1 is. 1 just doesn't fucking care about anything. But 3 is but when it comes to the notion of brotherhood, that it does falter a little bit. And Todd's idea was that Freud never talked about kind of sibling relationships. Todd said that Freud never talked about sibling relationships because he was sort of stuck in this kind of Germanic way of thinking, being from Austria, and he kind of neglected that part. He neglected that part of the of this sort of social structure, and concentrated really just on like children and parents and the authority structure between them. So you need to kind of, and actually, interestingly enough, I mentioned this point to. I have a friend who is like very well read on Freud. I mean, I've read basic books, but like I haven't like I'm not like super nerdy on it or anything. He is, and I mentioned this to him, and he said that was interesting because um, Freud is said in kind of like later in life apparently that he failed to think about siblings. He didn't really include that into his sort of conceptual framework, and he probably should have. Which is interesting also if you think about his relationship to Carl Jung, because they were sort of brotherly figures, and Freud always was trying to play the dad. He was always trying to play the father figure, and kind of he was always getting annoyed with him whenever Jung was being too challenging or conceptualizing about psychoanalysis in a way Freud didn't really particularly approve of. He kind of responded to that very defensively, and it led to like a lot of falling out between him and his other kind of contemporaries, which kind of makes sense that he kind of he didn't necessarily have a good he didn't have a well developed kind of capacity for fraternal um, dialogue or fraternal sort of social relations. Whereas if you think about the um, communist, um, although I will say that I do think just before I say this, the German model also came up with like social democracy and like strong welfare states. So it's not like they don't have any concept of equality. I think that is a bit of a. I think Todd's going a bit far there when he kind of says that you know, like they clearly do have a concept of sort of social commitment and social obligation, but maybe it's not so much seen as an equality. It's more seen as a kind of something that, that the sort of rich sort of should pay something to help the rest of society function, and fathers should commit to their sons, but it's not necessarily seen as an egalitarian form of social obligation, sort of. And again, this is where the whole left right wing thing just fails, because if you think about like social democracy, many people will say, "Oh, welfare state." It's very, again, this is like an Anglo model of thinking. It's like, "Oh, welfare state." That's very leftist. But actually, you see in like social democracy that there is also a kind of paternalistic sort of dynamic there, a kind of commitment to people, a commitment to society and to other people, but not necessarily a commitment which is like bound to extremely egalitarian principles either. It's sort of like, and again, even if you think of some German thinkers, like for example Peter Sloterdijk, has this idea that like the rich should pay taxes, but they shouldn't be forced to, because the honor of giving is sort of deprived when you kind of create this sort of like impersonalized tax system. There's a kind of, he calls it a kind of psychopolitical deprivation of giving, the kind of honor of giving, and that's a very kind of, I guess you could say it's a very Germanic way of thinking. It's like, yes, we should have social obligation, but there should be a lot of respect and a lot of like appreciation for those who give more. It's a kind of self-sacrificial, but the kind of the honor of self-sacrifice and the honor of responsibility is very much within the kind of more STEM family kind of mindset. Um, whereas if you got an argument against taxes, against forced taxation from the Anglosphere, it would just be like, no, we just want to hear money because we love money. It would just be like, it wouldn't talk about the honor of giving or anything. It wouldn't make a kind of sophisticated argument. It would just be like, no, 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 we just we just want to, we just want our money. Like fuck you, fuck poor people. Like fuck any social obligation. That's the mindset they sort of come from. I'm not being very nice to the absolute nuclear family, but I'll go into that in another detail, exactly why I think that's an over influence of system one is such a problem today. I'll go into that in a different video, but just to briefly bring this idea of brotherhood onto the communist or the communitarian family structure. You also see something interesting here, which is also quite Freudian, because as Todd points out at some point, I don't think it's even in this book, I think it's in a different book, but he says the interesting thing about the kind of communist or the communitarian family structure is the father is like this kind of patriarchal king, but the brothers are all treated really equally. And because the brothers are all really treated equally, the head of the house is always sort of worried that they'll sort of gang up on him, that they'll sort of team up and attack him. So it sort of increases the need for authority. So basically, like if your sons, or if you have like a kind of a son who you're giving your inheritance to, and he's everything, everyone sort of knows where they stand, and he has the one son that's inheriting everything, like let's say the oldest son, he's got this kind of higher sense of responsibility, and the other sons may sort of envy him, but because of that envy, there's a lack of, let's say, like uh, there's a lack of coherence. They're less likely to sort of gang up with each other on the father, if you get me. They're less likely to do that. Whereas if you have a system where the sons are very equal, and they have good, and they're kind of treated with a lot of camaraderie with each other, they're more likely to gang up on you. So the more likely they are to gang up on you, the more likely you are as a father to have to sort of increase your sort of authority to keep them in check. So within the sort of communitarian Russian communal family system, you have a tendency of like a notion of solidarity and equality among the brothers, but at the same time a really strong need for like a very strong, sometimes excessively strong, excessively powerful father figure, which is basically just Stalinism, right? I mean, think about that. It's like the guy is overseeing this kind of sense of camaraderie among all his people, but at the same time he's like paranoid. He's like really paranoid that they're always going to turn on him and like try to kill him. So it's kind of like a strong sense of egalitarianism that needs to be constantly kept in check with a simultaneous strong sense of authority, and that also sort of matches a lot of what Freud says, because Freud talks about the band of brothers in some of his books. He has this idea that like kind of primordial setting, a band of brothers had a tyrannical father figure, and they all ganged up and turned on him and killed him, and then they had this like guilt that they killed him, and then the guilt became like a superego. So that is a sort of another interesting kind of psychopolitical structure, which you don't really see properly unless you think about brotherhood and the way brotherhood like relates to equality or inequality, or like, you know, it kind of it's collective relationship to the father figure, to authority, and so on. So yeah, so that's a kind of overview of the basic, at least European family structures. I hope you enjoyed that, and yeah, like, subscribe, all that shit. Thank you.